I'd like to welcome everybody to the Middle East Institute. This is my boss. I'll try that again. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Middle East Institute. My name is Graham Bannerman. We're going to have a great session here today. This is part of the growing efforts of the Middle East Institute on all sorts of fronts during Middle Eastern issues. We have a new new Arab Spring initiative that's expanding our staff, and we're getting more involved in many things regarding the Middle East. I recommend to all of you to pay attention to our website and see all of the good things that are going on here. Today we're going to discuss the work of the Inspector General for Iraq over the last 8 years. We have a very special person who's been there for 8 years. In Washington, anybody who has served in a job for 8 years is unique, to be sure. And we hope that with all that experience, we'll all be able to learn from things that went well in Iraq and things that did not go as well in Iraq. But I think this is a great session to learn. Stuart Bowen, our speaker, is somebody of long-standing knowledge, not only of Iraq, but of Washington and how the United States works. He's a lawyer. He worked in the Texas government for a long time before coming to Washington, and then he worked in the White House, small tenure time in private practice, and then entered this job that is just completing. What's important about his job is he issued their final report on March 6th, and this final report had 7 recommendations, and I think we all should pay attention to these because we have invested a lot in Iraq and a lot in doing these things, and we've obviously done good things well, and we've obviously done things poorly, and he's going to sort of give us his recommendations. Following Stuart, Marvin Weinbaum of the Middle East Institute will also speak. Marvin is an expert on Afghanistan. I knew him first as a professor at the University of Illinois, and he was always a person that we in Washington, when we had a question of Pakistan or Afghanistan, would say, what does Marvin think? And then in more recent years, he's come to Washington, and we've been able to hear more often what he thinks, and it's still equally as important to us. So we're going to start with about 20 minutes from Stuart, and then Marvin will draw parallels with Afghanistan and make some comments, and then we're going to open it to questions. So we look forward for an interesting hour. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Graham, and it's great to be here at the Institute with Marvin, and thank you, Ambassador, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to see you again. Just a couple of amendments to the American remarks. This is actually my 9th year in this job, believe it or not, which makes it even more unique, I think. Interestingly, equally split between the Bush administration and the Obama administration when I'm done, almost exactly 50% in each. And people ask me, well, hey, has your experience been different with regard to, I guess, one, your background with Governor and President Bush, and then two, the changing approaches to Iraq over time. And I'm happy to say, I think that's the right word, no. It's been equally difficult. No, it's been an equally challenging program, and the State Departments, the Defense Departments have supported SIGR, Special IG for Iraq Reconstruction, a unique organization which has 4.5 months left of work to do. This report that we just put out, our last lessons learned report, Learning from Iraq, and we're going to have one for each of you. We're bringing up a box now. And it was part of what I envisioned at the outset that we had to do with regard to the Iraq program. You all know about the challenges that have been experienced there, the unique challenges, really, frankly, experienced also in Afghanistan, but less known because there hasn't been reporting from Afghanistan. For instance, you probably don't know that we've spent almost twice as much money in Afghanistan on rebuilding than we have in Iraq. 100 billion versus 60 in Iraq. There is a special IG for Afghan reconstruction, but not established until the middle of 2008. And so less known. What I saw at the outset over 9 years during that first trip, really encapsulated by one anecdote, the challenge that I was confronting, walking the halls of the Republican Palace in Baghdad. Coalition Provisional Authority then about 10 months underway, really headed towards closing down. As you remember, they were told in November of 2003, closed by June. So when they finally IG gets on the ground, You know, it's sort of the rush towards transfer. Two people in front of me walking the hall. One turns to the other and says, "We can't do that anymore. There's a new Inspector General here." And I knew then that there was a lot of oversight that was going to be done. What I saw was that, of course, we would have to do inspections. Of course, we would have to do audits, and we've done 390. We accomplished 390 of them. We saved $1.6 billion of your tax dollars along the way. And we've done a lot of investigations. 85 convictions to date. That's why we're still in business through September. We're going to get 20 more convictions before we're done. So about 105 convictions under our belt when we finish. And $300 million recovered from our investigations. So about $2 billion in financial benefits. One of the unique things, aren't many government agencies that paid for themselves several times over. We have. And I'm proud of that in carrying out our mission. But I guess I'm most proud of this lessons learned effort, of which this is the last, because as I was saying, what I saw early on was we had to tell the story of what was going on in Iraq and learn from it. And that's what we started out in 2005 with our first report on personnel. Then we did one on contracting, then one on program management, then hard lessons, which you might have seen, the book-length study of how we got into Iraq and the rebuilding program. Then applying hard lessons, which I'm still trying to do. That's what I'm here to talk about today. And my theme has continued since then about this main reform issue, which I'm going to focus on for the balance of my talk. And then studies of auditing, inspections, and investigations, and finally learning from Iraq, which I think is our most accessible report because it's got lots of graphs and photos in it, and it's very succinct, concise, and gives you 7 chapters that lead to 7 lessons. And the 7 chapters give you the overview of oversight in a war zone, how much money we spent, $60 billion, where it was spent through 5 funds, the Iraq Relief and Reconstruction Fund, $20 billion, the Iraq Security Forces Fund, $20 billion, CERP, the Commander's Emergency Response Program, an innovation invented in Iraq. U.S. soldiers building water plants with tax dollars, bags of tax dollars, in cash. Matter of fact, 1/3 of our convictions come from CERP, the CERP program, because that much cash sitting next to an E5 was sometimes hard to resist. I would just say it was the exception. Most served honorably, but that's a revelation of the Iraq program. You need better controls. Don't flood a war zone with cash. You think that's obvious, but I can tell from your response. But it's also a lesson because it was observed in the breach in Iraq. 4th fund, Economic Support Fund. The traditional account from the State Department. About $6 billion, almost $6 billion, spent there, most of it in capacity building, most of it towards the latter stages of the program. And finally, the INCL fund, the INL law enforcement fund, spent in the last couple of years to pick up where the military left off in the police training program with mixed results. That totaling about $53 billion in the key funds, which I have been focused on for the last 9 years. We talk about the effects, and I would say when you get your book, Chapter 2 is the one to focus on. I did 44 interviews for this report, starting with Prime Minister Maliki, Deputy Prime Minister Shahrastani, 15 other Iraqi leaders, and Generals Petraeus, Odierno, Ambassadors Crocker, Hill, Jeffrey, Deputy Secretary Bill Burns, Secretary Panetta, and asked them 2 questions. Also 12 members of the Hill, McCain, Collins, McCaskill, McKeon. And I said, what, in your view, are the effects of the Iraq rebuilding program? We spent all this money, to what effect? And 2, what are your primary lessons? Fascinating series of responses that tease out and gel into the last chapter, the other one to focus on, which is the 7 lessons from Iraq. And unsurprisingly, lesson number 1 is the same lesson as lesson number 1 from hard lessons, and that is the United States must reform its approach to planning, executing, and overseeing stabilization and reconstruction operations. We don't have a coherent system in place now within our government. And this is the venue in which our national security interests are most going to be engaged in the modern era. They are. Since 1982, we've been in a stabilization and reconstruction operation of some sort. Every year but 2. Balkans was not small. That was a fairly substantial, lengthy, expensive operation, different from Iraq. Obviously, they're all different. But they all are civ mil. They all require a variety of elements to be coordinated and integrated together to succeed. But integration is what's missing, because we don't have a systemic capacity established within our government to plan for the civ mil execution. And that is what I suggest in here. In Chapter 6, if you want to get into the details of that, lays out my proposal, and it is to take these scattered pieces, or at least elements of the management and oversight of them, and give them order by assigning someone responsibility. Occam's razor: no one's in charge, put somebody in charge. That's the analytical tool in attacking this problem. So I call it the U.S. Office for Contingency Operations. Call it what you will. It kind of would be like a FEMA for international disasters. These failures are disasters of sorts. But what it would do is it would add integration to these entities. Right now we have something called the Bureau for Conflict and Stabilization Operations at State, run by Rick Barton, my friend, who's perfectly qualified, the most qualified guy in the world to run it, and because he established the Office of Transition Initiatives, its twin, over at AID, which has been operating well since the mid-90s, doing discrete, targeted stabilization elements around activities around the world. Both of them, as Rick told me when I met with him a couple of weeks ago, stacking up wins, but neither of them ready for this, or whatever the next one is, major stabilization and reconstruction operations. I think we don't want to do Iraq and Afghanistan again. Let's just start that, put that up front. But I would also say in response, we won't. But we have to plan for all forms of possible stabilization and reconstruction operations that might present themselves, because we don't get to pick which fragile state falls into failure and requires engagement. So you have OTI, you have CSO, you have the Office of Technical Assistance at Treasury. That department's office that deals with this, also created in the 1990s, curiously. These have all been created in response to the modern advent of stabilization operations. I think that's something to keep in mind. Agencies have responded piecemeal to the events of the modern era, to these national security challenges, but not in an integrated fashion. And this is about providing coherence to our architecture, my suggestion is. Then we have, in 2005, Donald Rumsfeld's signature on something called DoD Directive 3001.05. A significant event at the Pentagon that established stabilization operations as a fundamental doctrine of the military. And that led to sort of this filling of the space, as General Petraeus has called it, in the rebuilding sector. And it's not sorted out yet by any stretch. And who will be in charge, how it will be integrated, is a question that's out there and applicable perhaps soon. Who knows in Syria? We don't know what's going to happen there, but it's another huge and most organized and well-funded piece of this panoply of pieces that comprise our stabilization capacity. And then the last one, Justice Department, has something called ISITAP, created also in the early 90s, also to carry out stabilization operations support to fragile states that needed the rule of law bolstering. And they did a lot of good work in Iraq. Make no mistake in helping provide training for judicial security, for prosecutorial, for revisions of the Constitution. But again, also in their stovepipe. So Treasury, good work working on the currency and the financial system. Justice, good work working on the judicial security issue. USAID, working on capacity building. State, improvising, creating the Quick Response Fund, creating the Office of Provincial Affairs, the PRT program. And DoD trying to fill this space by spending this CERT money. All these pieces moving around that ultimately became contingent upon the efficacy of the commander and the ambassador syncing up well together. So our success, to some extent, was dependent upon personalities. And that is not a great strategy. And a better strategy is to have a coherent system that assigns responsibility with clarity, and therefore accountability is possible. And that is somewhat what was missing in the adhocracy of Iraq. I call it the acronymic adhocracy. CPA, PCO, PMO, IRMO, ITAL, ISPO, those are all acronyms of entities that don't exist anymore, that were all created year on, year on, year on, in what I call the 9 one-year reconstruction programs that we had in Iraq as they unfolded from 2003 through 2012. And there's a better way. You know, I mean, ultimately what you hear in the Iraqi interviews when you read in chapter 2 here is a frustration that, hey, the United States, the most powerful country in the world, we expected more. First of all, they expected us to consult with them more. That's their main complaint. You know, you came in, as Bill Burns says, we came in and tried to do it all and do it our own way. And that caused disjuncts, waste. I say at least $8 billion in waste. It caused fraud. I say at least $1 billion in fraud. But more importantly, it didn't achieve that overarching goal of how we want to spend this money. And that is to win hearts and minds, to achieve stability. That's why they're called stabilization operations. This week is not a pretty week in Iraq. This month, a painful and bloody month. Last month, the bloodiest month since June of 2008. And the prospects for 2013, difficult at best in that country as they move into another transition in power next year, when Prime Minister Maliki will be subject to vote through the parliamentary elections of next April. These are lessons to be learned. That's what learning from Iraq is all about. I think it's aptly titled, We Must Learn from Iraq. We can't forget about it. I hear on the Hill sometimes, we don't want to talk about Iraq anymore, it's over. Well, that's a problem too. I think the truth is that absorbing what didn't go right, rather than as a lesson in blame, it's a lesson of instruction. And what we can learn and apply systemically that will provide coherence as we move forward will turn Iraq ultimately, I hope, into a positive event for us systemically, so that when we engage in stabilization operations again, there will be integration. Coordination is not enough. Coordination depends on personalities. Integration is about training. It's about systems. It's about capacity. And it's got to begin with an acceptance of the reality that these operations are civ mil. And if the civilian and the military, both sides, can accept that premise, give a little to get a lot in developing that integration, I think we won't see 10-year operations. I mean, as we've seen in Afghanistan and Iraq, endless stabilization operations that have cost us too much in blood and treasure. All right, thank you for your time. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to your questions, but let me first turn it over to Murray for some insights into Afghanistan. Key issue here is, have the lessons from Iraq been learned in Afghanistan? And I think you'll hear in a minute the answer. Thank you.
Well, let me start by saying that I have no special claim on expertise about Iraq. And nor am I a specialist in stabilization, reconstruction, and oversight operations. My experience is Afghan, Pakistan, and yes, there are lessons to be learned here. And yes, indeed, we learned from Iraq. Unfortunately, in Afghanistan, what we learned from Iraq was all the wrong things, and I'm not referring here to these kinds of operations, but what we found there, or what was found there, was a learning on how to better kill people in terms of IEDs and suicide bombers. Unfortunately, that was the major transfer of know-how. Well, about the Afghan experience, Certainly, the stabilization reconstruction efforts have been marked with problems that do show a lack of integration of departments and agencies, and they have contributed, among other things, to an absence of goals that are comprehensive, consistent, or clearly stated. Stabilization in Afghanistan was given over largely to the provincial reconstruction teams, the PRTs. And indeed, they were meant to be an example of integration at the ground level with mainly military personnel, primarily military, but civilians from various government departments, State Department, agriculturalists, and so on, as well as also integrating the Kabul government's involvement through its own ministries. That didn't work too well. And the PRTs themselves were a mixed lot. Some showed some success, others certainly not. Problem that we face everywhere is this constant turnover of personnel, the lack of institutional memory as one team replaces another team. The other part of the stabilization, though, was under the control of USAID, and it had what was known as a local government development program. Both of these are well over $1 billion programs, and they were, if anything, demonstrated over time a lack of comprehensive monitoring or evaluation. There was a CIGAR audit that perhaps most of you are familiar with, and it certainly demonstrated that. Of course, when we talk about a lack of evaluation, we have to recognize that in Afghanistan, for much of the time, monitoring was dangerous. Except for a few early years, this has never been a post-conflict operation, especially if we're talking about the east and the south of the country. But in any event, most efforts that we can look at, whether by AID or the military-led operation, which went under the title of Commander's Emergency Response Program, most of these were short-term interventions. They were, they show, as we look back at it, they show a little evidence here of any long-term security gains. Stabilization activities were, for most of the time, to leave behind very little local capacity, which I think is one of the great faults of the program. Heavy funding through the years created perverse incentives and led to the backing, as is often pointed out now, of strong men and contracts that managed most of all to fuel corruption. The U.S. is now in the process of phasing out these PRTs, and so we're having a real test about whether there's anything left behind to take its place. But whatever it is, there's a lack of documentation about the impact of stabilization programs. Now, would a Office of Contingency Operations, such as is suggested here, have contributed to a more rationalized program, to a better set of operations? No question about it. It would have. Let me, though, take my remaining time here and raise, however, a few questions about particularly about this office, which would do essentially what Stuart Bowen has suggested needs to be done, and you'll read about that as you look at the report. This USOCO. A large part of this is about, as we've heard from Stuart, preparing for the next time. And of course, we're talking here about foreign commitments. And we will, whatever it is, whatever we learn, from Afghanistan and Pakistan, we'll be carrying the baggage of those two countries, the scars of those two countries as we go forward into another stabilization operation. As you'll see in the report, this is dependent upon here of action by the Congress. And to my knowledge, there's been not the progress that certainly we would have wanted to see on this. And the reason for it should not be difficult, of course, beyond simply creating a new bureaucracy as it will be viewed. What struck me here is to what extent the people in Congress will view this planning, execution, oversight as an institution devoted to post-conflict nation building, state building. And by the way, I dislike the term nation building because in none of these countries are we building a nation. We're talking about states. Nations are a matter of identity. And that's not something we're in the business to contribute to. But when we look forward now, and the examples of how we might implement such a institution, we're looking at Syria. We're looking at Yemen, perhaps, or Somalia. Not exactly the kind of place where our members of Congress would like to see us have a presence at all. Syria particularly, and it's used, and Stuart does use Syria as an example here, and this is clearly going to be one that we keep in mind. After all, we have to say how different Syria will be. In Iraq, as we came in, the field was, the terrain was cleared because we defeated the Iraqi army. We were in total control of the landscape. Similarly, in the early years in Afghanistan, we had routed the Taliban. As we come into if we do, into a stabilization situation in Syria, we're going to be faced, it seems to me, and I'm sure this is on the minds of people on the Hill, with a myriad of armed, politically minded groups competing for ascendance, a very different kind of landscape than we saw as we set up operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan. In the report, there is an institutional analog here to FEMA. And as you read, you'll see why that makes some sense. Of course, we have to then ask, is it all likely to have the same kind of resources? Because its constituencies are so very different. Its mission, the impelling character of its mission, so very different. One also has to ask here about how will a freestanding structure like the USOCO, will it be going in with the disadvantage? Because I think what's very clear here is to take it out of any one of the departments and have it so that it better integrates several departments or agencies. Will it be able to gain the resources that it's going to need as a freestanding institution? Major problem it strikes me is that in the response to stabilization and reconstruction, you're involved here with other aid donors. And what I've seen in Afghanistan, at least, is that at least a good portion of the lack of coordination was because we weren't the only operation in town. And so much of what was going on was overlapping and conflicting operations because of the priorities, the interests of other donor countries and agencies. Will the USOCO be able to work with this kind of environment if it has to do so? Some of the strongest tensions in Afghanistan in the stabilization program were with the non-government organizations, the NGOs. This was a particularly difficult problem because the NGOs constantly carped that what we were doing by getting into the business, particularly because it had to be a military operation with the PRTs, is we were blurring the differences here between relief operations and reconstruction operations that were that blurred the differences between civilians and military, and that therefore they were put at risk. Their programs were going to be misunderstood. They were in putting themselves and their programs in danger because of the involvement in stabilization, but particularly reconstruction here. I think what we have to be very careful here of also is that the operation be one in which can be adjusted easily to the fact that we may be finding ourselves in situations where we've had a centralized or at least potentially strong government, such as in Iraq, and those that are traditionally decentralized and accustomed to weak governments, such as we found in Afghanistan. Also, what we found in Afghanistan was the role that the indigenous governing authority plays. How do you get that government, the Kabul government in this case, to buy into this kind of approach, especially when that government clearly does not want full accountability? Will a USOCO, in its oversight functions, be able to confront questions? It will have to confront questions of what degree of corruption is tolerable, yes, even necessary. How much slack should there be? Do we stand the danger of too high expectations? This certainly has been something we've had to deal with. Could an institutionalized model applied to other countries, if we're not able to adjust, could it lead to an IMF-style one-size-fits-all? I think this is something we have to be careful about. Well, I want to wind up here. I just raised some of these issues. I haven't talked about whether we can get the kind of integration between military and civilian, this certainly was a real problem in Afghanistan, continues to be one that's regularly cited. But what we have to be careful is that however important it is, and I think that the case is made very well in the report and in Stuart Bowen's remarks, however important it is to have an integrating mechanism, such as is recommended, that at the same time, we recognize that that is just one component, and that most of what goes wrong and goes right occurs at the ground level, and it's there that we ultimately will have to be able to improve our performance. And then finally, I end with the sad fact that whatever else we do, there simply are players out there who, for whatever their reasons, don't want to be coordinated, don't want to be integrated. And I think we have to accept that. Thank you.
What I would like to do now is at least give Stuart time to respond to some of the issues raised by Marv. And then we'll open it to questions. I'm sure everybody has several questions here.
Great, thank you. Very briefly, Winston Churchill said those who plan do better than those who don't, even if they rarely stick to that plan. But his point is, planning matters. And improvising, pursuing a stabilization operation through adhocracies, making it up as you go along is worse. It's the poorer path. It's the one we don't want. It's the hardest lesson from Iraq and Afghanistan, for that matter. And so USOCO, again, is an argument, really. It's a strawman argument, really underlying this key point that we have to plan better. And if you plan better, you'll execute better. And and in order to execute better, you have to oversee better. Those are certainly lessons from Iraq. And I think all of the issues that were raised about the challenges inherent in our current system are valid. There is bureaucratic resistance. There are rice bowls being defended. There are stovepipes in place. But that was the case in 1986 in a different context, when Goldwater-Nichols changed the way we plan and execute and oversee military operations to great effect, seen in Panama and then the first Gulf War, and then, for whatever your thoughts on the whys, the execution of the second engagement in Iraq. Very effective air-land battle doctrine realized on the ground through jointness. And I guess that's the word I want to leave you with. Integration is about what we'd like to see out of the process, the effect of which is jointness. And there was a hearing by the Commission on Wartime Contracting, very revealing on this point, underscoring my experience in Iraq. This looked at Afghanistan, and it called senior leaders from DOD, aid, and state to the table and asked them a simple question: who's in charge of the rebuilding program in Afghanistan? They couldn't answer. And that was the case 5 years ago when they held that hearing. And John Sopko, the cigar special IG for Afghan Reconstruction, last week at a CNAS event said the question that he keeps hearing in Afghanistan as well is, who's in charge? A question that can't be answered. And if so simple a question can't be answered about so important an operation, well, then I think we have a fundamental institutional systemic problem that has to be remedied. And so my focus really in my work and in the lessons learned effort is to articulate the problem in a clear way and substantiate it with evidence, and to provide documentary support for decision makers. And no doubt that's a policy point. Politics intervene as well. I was in a senator's office this morning talking about this, and when I mentioned Syria, he said, "Don't ever say Syria, because that's radioactive." And I think that's just emblematic of the challenges in making this kind of argument. But notwithstanding the events of the moment, I think places like the Middle East Institute and others around town who play an important role in articulating this message and delving into it can help emphasize this space that's yet unfilled, and that's a crucial space that will protect our national security interests in the future, and that's the planning, execution, and oversight of stabilization and reconstruction operations. So thank you for your time.
Please, why don't you stay up here?
Okay.
Marvin, and now I'd like to open it to questions from the room. Please.
Suleiman Wasti from the Middle East Institute. Stuart, thank you so much for your time, and it's always refreshing to hear from you. I took your hard lessons when I went to Iraq 2 years ago. My two observations quickly. One is the basic premise is slightly flawed toward all the fragile countries, be it Maghreb, Balkans, East Africa, Iraq, Afghanistan. We treat them as post-conflict countries, and actually they are mid-conflict countries. So the priorities need to be determined for reconstruction. You don't need to come up with mini Marshall plans for soccer stadiums and all these kind of things. So, and that's the first one. The second part is and that leads to the integration, and you correctly said it should be coordination. And Marvin mentioned the other donors, they don't even have their own plans. You have the Paris Declaration for Iraq, you have the UN Development Assistance Framework. So I think the basic idea is that even if you have small agencies doing the work, like UNESCO for shrine restoration, they should be an overall responsible mechanism.
Yes.
And which I totally agree with you. Thank you again.
Several years ago, I was at a meeting like this on Cambodia. Cambodian woman who survived the Khmer Rouge began her talk by thanking the Vietnamese for saving her life. It seems to me that Vietnam's campaign against the Khmer Rouge was the most successful counterinsurgency in modern history. What lessons can we learn about stabilization from Vietnam and Cambodia? What did they do so successfully with regard to stabilization?
Not an expert on either topics, but I think it points to an issue that Marvin was underscoring, and that's the civ mil disjunct in executing stabilization and reconstruction operations that exist today. And whatever the facts underlying that event, they were integrated. There was no such disjunct in realizing such. But you underscore a more important point, and that USOCO would solve, and that's developing a common language about these operations. Some people call them stabilization and reconstruction operations, others call them COIN, when looking at the same series of events. And not having a common language, this gets to the civ mil disjunct point, between the civilian and the military agencies, creates a communication problem quite straightforwardly, wherein those who are assigned to tackle the same set of problems can't talk about them coherently enough, and that weakens the overall effort. USOCO could begin to develop commonality of language, and Marvin's point is well taken about Afghanistan, that's not there, it wasn't there in Iraq, and it's yet to be fixed in our system.
Well, Cutler, I just wondered if we've been there, done that when it comes to Iraq, and there's a tendency to say, well, let's go on to something else, if not in the same way. But what about, do you think anybody in the current government in Iraq is going to be reading your book and learning useful things there?
Well, I think so. We translate it into Arabic, and we said, so that's the first step, right? And which we've done with all our reports, by the way, and they do get read. And actually, I was talking with Dr. Bassett, who's the head of the Central Bank of Iraq, yesterday morning, about some of these elements that currently are under his jurisdiction, specifically corruption, huge problem, and one that didn't get sufficiently addressed, and one that they're paying attention to for various reasons. Hard to discern all of them, but as I've called it several times in our past reporting, corruption in Iraq is the second insurgency, and for a while became the first insurgency. That superseding the combative one. The combative one is surging back. Sorry to say, sorry to use that word, but the reality is corruption is there, insecurity is there, and they're reading it, both to discover some of the causes for both, I think, but also to help them develop their own approach to how they go forward, because they're trying to learn from recent history. Also, there's a ulterior motive as well. Truth be told, the Iraqi government is still quite angry about what happened in 2003 and 2004, and the United States had supervision over $17 billion in Iraqi money during that period, and the Iraqis have made clear to me that they are interested in pursuing some kind of claim with regard to that. So they don't have time for that now, but we'll see later. I think it'd be a big mistake, as I've told them, by the way. Please.
Hi, Doug Brooks, formerly with the International Stability Operations Association. This idea of this USOCO, I think, is one that would be strongly supported by the industry. Any sort of coordination, standardization would be welcomed by companies that were working for different agencies and having to do different rules and having different forms of oversight and everything. It was very difficult. The big trip up, of course, is having the U.S. government admit that it has a problem it's going to be doing this in the future, and that it needs this kind of organization. Are there champions on the Hill right now that are willing to push this through? And what do we do to develop that?
Champions might be a stretch, looking for a champion, but there are interested parties in the Senate and the House. Was meeting with some yesterday. Have been meeting with some all year. I think it's not a question of identifying the problem, it's a question of shaping and crafting and implementing the solution. Because there are, to use my two favorite metaphors, rice bowls and stovepipes in the way. And they're substantial, the long-standing institutional interest. But there were in 1986 as well. So there is an important precedent, I think. I say that this is more difficult because that was one department. This is multiple departments. But John McCain clearly identifies this in his interview with me in Chapter 2. Ryan Crocker, Brent Scowcroft, all have articulated support for it, and Senator Graham from South Carolina likes this, among others. So Chairman Wolf on the House side recently. So there, yes. Yeah, short answer to your question, there are a number of those who recognize the problem and see this as a potential solution, but it hasn't quite gelled into a champion's quest yet.
Gene Dewey, former State Department. Thank you very much for both of these presentations. Very enlightening. It seemed that one of the most useful lessons identified for developing USOCO would be why the original S/CRS failed. Mm-hmm. Remember, that was set up under Carlos Pascual. Yes. I was president of the creation of that one, so I have some stripes on my back for that one. And why Rick Barton's outfit is probably going to be very limited in its success. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that one of the reasons that the original SCRS failed is that they felt that all the tools of statecraft and all the toolboxes needed to be U.S. tools. So they tried to replicate in one organization all the competence of government from U.S. sources. And although we tried to get them to realize there was a United Nations that had some tools of statecraft that have been shown to be useful and relevant, there was no competence in that office to identify or to use or to get productivity out of those multilateral tools. Mm-hmm. Have you given any thought to that, Stuart?
Yes. Great points, all. And you're exactly right. USOCO to succeed would have to succeed in a multilateral capacity. And that's what's missing also as our multilateral partners look at the United States. They say, where's our partner? There are the UK Stabilization Unit, Canada, Denmark, Norway, Australia even, are moving forward with similar integrated offices to different degrees, much smaller, but nevertheless fitting within the concept. But they don't know who to call, really, here about that. It was SCRS, and I'm glad you brought it up because Chapter 6 lays it out in this report, and it spells out that SCRS was created to. It's not that the United States didn't identify the problem. We did. NSPD 44, President Bush said, "Hey, State Department, take the lead, go forth, integrate, make this work." But I think one of the lessons of Iraq, as with PDD 56 back in the 90s, is you can't fix this institutional problem through presidential orders. That's a couple of decades lesson there. This has to be fixed on the Hill, I think, because both PDD 56 worked, under Len Hawley's leadership in the Balkans, I think, quite well, but went away on January 22nd of 2001, right? And so did NSPD 44 sometime in early 2009. So that's not how we're going to fix this problem. My complaint about SCRS is that it didn't engage. If you're created to solve the Iraq problem, go to Iraq and engage. Don't plan for Haiti and Cuba. Because ultimately when Haiti happened, they were all ready to go and they didn't get invited. And because by that time they'd lost their momentum as an institution, even though hundreds of millions have been poured in, and we created something called the Civilian Response Corps, which ceased to be on March 1st of this year. It's not that we didn't try. And I just don't think that it was integrated enough, and it got, as you well know, lost in the bureaucracy of the State Department, and then kicked down to Springfield, and then that was the beginning of the end at that moment. John Herbst, who took over from Carlos, said last week at NDU, he said he thought that the SCRS state-only model would be the way to go, but he now thinks USOCO is the way to go, because there has to be an integrated capacity that's pulled out of the bureaucracies, that brings CivMil together, and then has the independence, and isn't subject to, as he said, the whims of the Secretary's interests at that moment. And he said that, he's told me on other occasions, that he was able to get things done with the Secretary's support. And of course his bill didn't get passed until 2009. And at that point the sun was low in the sky for SCRS. Yes, sir.
Dakhil Shammu, Voice of America, the Call Service. Let's assume that some people in the Iraqi government will read the report and then come to you and ask you a question: what type of operations are needed for Iraq in the future? What would be your answer?
Well, my answer is not the one I would give them directly, which is the days of Uncle Sugar are over. We gave the $60 billion program was the most generous program in U.S. history. I mean, the Marshall Plan was all loans. I mean, make no mistake, the ECA, if a project wasn't going forward, they stopped it. Not the case in Iraq, unfortunately. A lot of our audits point out projects that went forward, failure after failure, and that's unwise and not good planning. What I would tell them, though, to answer your question with regard to how the United States can help, I think there are two important ways. One is what we're doing through the Foreign Military Sales and Foreign Military Financing Program. That's our most important engagement in Iraq today, providing 36 F-16s over the next 2 years, and Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, things that are going to build their own capacity to defend their borders in a meltdown moment. And then second is our capacity to help them on the rule of law front, and this is where to me, the overarching lesson, apart from the institutional and structural things I've talked about, whenever the United States ever engages at any level in any stabilization operation anywhere, ever again, begin with the rule of law. Then get to electricity and oil and whatever. But do the rule of law first. Because if you don't have that under control, it doesn't matter if the lights work or if your oil's getting exported. Because mayhem can ensue, absence a sensible and enforceable rule of law system. And that's, that mayhem, unfortunately, is somewhat seen in Baghdad today. More bombs. Yesterday, over 90 killed. The last 5 days, 260 deaths. May pass April at this rate, and that's tragic. And let me just throw one other aspect into that, and I don't, this is relevant to what's going on in Iraq today, and maybe there's an intelligence component that we can help on. I don't know exactly how. But al-Baghdadi is now in Syria, the leader of AQI, and is displacing Golani on the al-Nusra front. And that's, if Zawahiri blesses that, I think things can get worse. Will get worse. Yes, sir.
Rahman Jaburi. I was here in 2003, one of those people who was basically asked to help with the planning to Iraq.
Yes.
We were in Arlington at that time, and I don't think even there is the will to do the planning at that time at all.
Right.
That's one. So, and when I say there is no will for the planning, it is by choosing the counterpart for the American. I was an Iraqi citizen at that time. I'm an American citizen right now. The way we chose the people to advise us on Iraq. If you go back now, who of these people is still there, first, to help? Second, how many of these people who are American citizens and they are involved in the corruption and nobody hold them, accountable? My other things is, for this nice report, people who go to Afghanistan, Iraq, they went through a little bit of orientation, like 2 hours to know the country. I suggested for you or whoever is responsible of this, use this report part of the orientation for the people we're hiring, because the end of the day, a human being is the resource of everything. So expose them for some this experience of Afghanistan and Iraq, if we are thinking of Syria, or hopefully we are not.
Exactly.
But if we are thinking, expose people for such report, for that we're going to hold people accountable this time and not just lesson learning. Let's go.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Well, good comments, and I totally agree with that. I think General Petraeus' interview says exactly what you said, which is before you begin a stabilization operation, remember my first point is do set rule of law first, but before you even enter, before you get close, is understand the politics, the culture, the economy, the education system, the capacity, so that you can target your aid in an appropriate fashion. The phrase I heard, I'll never forget, when I first went over there, it was best of breed. We're going to give Iraq the best of everything. And we gave them a great water treatment plant in Nasiriyah, you know. And it was top of the line, turned it on down in south central Iraq. Ur of the Chaldees, by the way, is where it was located. And the 5 cities it served did not have plumbing systems capable to withstand that pressure. So when they turned it on, suddenly it was like 4th of July in New York, water exploding everywhere. And then when we went and inspected that plant in 2010, it was operating at 20%. And that was the single most expensive project we did. So it encapsulates the problems when you don't target your projects to the capacity of the country at hand. And then on to your planning points of 10 years ago. Actually, it was 10 years ago tomorrow that UN Security Council Resolution 1483 was issued, which blessed the CPA as the occupying authority of Iraq, created the development fund for Iraq, and gave the CPA charge of it to spend and be the government of Iraq for the benefit of the people of Iraq. That was an enormous shift from what had been planned just 2 months earlier, March 10th, which was liberate and leave. Matter of fact, President Bush approved, as we point out in Hard Lessons. He said, don't disband the Army, use them as a rebuilding force. Do limited debathification. And have an election very quickly, which is what Jay Garner and Zal Khalilzad were doing in trying to set up in April and early May when the CPA suddenly came and superseded all of that plans, and we went to occupy and rebuild, embodied by UNSCR 1483.
Hi there, Sam Desai. I work at CSIS with Tony Cordesman.
Great. Yeah. Great.
First of all, thanks for all your work on this over the last 9 years.
Thank you.
Who watched the region, especially Iraq, have been digesting all of your quarterly reports and waited for them, and we appreciate this final report.
Thank you.
One topic that was not touched on that I wanted to ask about was your idea of any Iranian activity in Iraq. I think as we stand about midway between the end of U.S. military forces in Iraq and the coming transition in 2014 in Afghanistan, one potential risk, one potential area that I think that we could apply some good lessons are what Iran is doing in the region, and if we're going to hand over the region to Iran.
We're not going to hand over the region to Iran, but I think open sources indicate the problem, and the problem really is this. Prime Minister Maliki has said supportive words about the Assad regime, sort of asserting his position, contrary to to I think, what the international community is expecting, and contrary to what's going on from a human rights perspective in Syria. And then, of course, open sources quite clearly indicate it's apparent that Iraq has turned a blind eye to arms transshipments at least through their airspace from Iran to Syria. Those are simply aggravating factors in a situation that is extraordinarily difficult, is tragic for the Syrian people, and for which no apparent solution is currently before us, and therefore it's going to be a very challenging year with regard to all of those issues.
Let me say we're going to have to end with a trilogy of questions, starting with Ed Peck, and then you, and then over there, the three people per system.
Short trilogy. Edward Peck, a former State Department Arabist. I would gladly work in your program, although I would ask some hard questions and then do what I'm told. I'm a chartered and licensed public skeptic.
Great.
When you talk about coordination, I spent a lot of time in my years since retirement working with the military, which was unified some years ago, and look how well it's worked out. They cooperate so fully that it's almost terrifying because they don't care about this or that. They do what they want, and I offer you the classic illustration of how well coordination works when they set up the Director of National Intelligence.
Right.
They put 22 agencies in there whose smooth functioning together we have seen demonstrated several times in the last couple of months.
Yes.
The other thing that concerns me the most, however, is how the excellent work that you have done, and I'm quite serious,
Thank you.
reflects one of the things that concerns me the most. The word is arrogance. That we are convinced that we know the best way for them to do everything.
Yes.
And this seems to color everything we do overseas, and we do it in public, which is highly offensive. In my day, if you went to tell the foreign minister that you thought that his behavior indicated clearly that his parents weren't married at the moment of his conception, you didn't come out and then tell the press that you said that to him. Now we tell everybody what they should do forcefully, dynamically. If we are going to remake the world, which has been announced as one of our national goals, in our own image, would there be some utility in discovering what skills are needed and developing those skills by making Mississippi like New Hampshire, or vice versa? It's not going to be easy or quick, and there at least we have some understanding of the cultures, which we don't have in Afghanistan or Iraq. Excuse me.
QED.
Okay.
Well, actually, let me. Bill Burns, a guy who I really respect and have come to know, and who a lot of you know, said this in the interview. A key lesson learned from Iraq is that the United States should not enter an SRO expecting to do it all and do it our own way. We must share the burden better multilaterally and engage the host country constantly on what is truly needed. This is both a planning and an executory responsibility. Meeting immediate needs is where we can best add value. Starting small on the rebuilding front makes sense as a rule of thumb. Regarding interagency reform, the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization is a good start, but a broader interagency capacity is needed to promote improved coordination among state, USAID, and the Pentagon.
Wait, let's have the final two questions. That one and that one.
Thank you. Karwan Zabari with the Kurdistan Regional Government's Representation Office. Throughout the last decade, you would often hear from the government officials, both military and civilian, that Kurdistan region was a model that they wanted to implement throughout the region, throughout the Iraq. Why wasn't it? Simply because of its stability and security. Why wasn't it? What was it that the Kurds were doing that we couldn't implement throughout the region? The second part of the question is military cells to Iraq. Do you think Iraq is ready for military cells, considering what's going on today?
Good questions I got in Kurdistan during my trip last September. And the answer is, first of all, Erbil, the single best project we did in Iraq. Like Nasiriyah, same idea. Huge project, massive success, because the Kurds committed to it and have built it in, and it's now providing clean water to everyone in Erbil, the capital of Kurdistan. The reality, you already answered your question. The Kurdistan only got $3 billion of the 60. because it was stable. You know, second lesson of my 7 is don't build significant reconstruction projects in unstable zones. And so then you might say, well, that argues for Kurdistan, but the point is stabilization money is for stabilization purposes, right? Start small, and so it was down south where we spent it, and down south where the $8 billion was wasted. And then your second point, your question also self-answers as well. There is concern on the part of the Kurdish government about Iraq's acquisition of all of these weapons for fear that they'll be used against them.
The last question over here.
Frank Gunner, Lehigh University. We met in Baghdad.
Yes.
If the first best solution is integration of the Civ mill, which might not or probably won't occur, how about the second best solution of when you find people work well together, keep them? 2006, General Casey and Ambassador Khalilzad seemed to work together very well. Why not keep them there until the war?
That's what USOCO would do. That is exactly a core point. Like FEMA doesn't show up and then rotate out, you know, halfway through the disaster recovery period. They go and they stay until it's done. And my proposal, Appendix A, do we have the books here? They're downstairs. Books are downstairs. Get them as you leave. See Appendix A for the bill. It's kind of like the Stafford Act in that the President would declare a stabilization and reconstruction operation begins now and then ends now. And so for that period, USOCO's capacity to use the contingency fund that would be established and to do all of these things like FEMA does in rebuilding Moore, Oklahoma right now, would operate, and they would stay. And so you would have someone in charge of it from beginning to end. SIGIR was really the only team that stayed. I had 8 people stay 5 years or longer in Iraq. Pretty much everyone else, other than, you know, a few at the top, stayed a year. And that's why I've described the Iraq program as 9 one-year rebuilding programs rather than a 9-year program.
Well, listen, I'd like to thank you very much. You can see a session went well. I didn't get to ask any of my 6 questions that I had, but I think we should all be thankful to Stuart and to Marvin for what they presented. I think we all learned a great deal. Thank you very much.
And everybody can pick up a copy of the report on the check-in desk downstairs as you go out. Thank you.
Marvin, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Really. Graham, thank you very much. Nice to meet you. Hey, Graham. Excellent. I think your points are exactly right. These questions are important. Hey, look, it's a shrinking target. It's like it's a 10% chance. Just because something's hard doesn't mean I shouldn't advance it, right?
No, look, Ed, you're the guy.
Yeah.
Nobody else has to credentials to be able to make it, so it will be the best shot.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Had a hero in public service.
Thank you. So wow. Well, may I hit record? I want to take you to lunch, and we'll visit. That's an honor, and I appreciate your words. And you know.